It started with a scratching sound. Claire first heard it on a quiet autumn night while reading in her small, dimly lit apartment. At first, she dismissed it as the old building settling, a common enough occurrence in the creaky, century-old structure. But over the next few nights, the sound grew louder, an insistent skittering beneath the floorboards, moving from one end of the room to the other. "Rats," her neighbor muttered when she mentioned it in passing. "This place is full of them. Best get some traps." Claire shuddered. She didn't like the idea of rats, but the noise was becoming unbearable. Worse, she swore she could hear it even when the floor was still, as though tiny claws were scratching in her walls, inside her head. One night, the scratching grew violent, like something was clawing desperately to get out. Claire couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. At 2 a.m., she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement, determined to see what was going on. The basement was a maze of pipes and shadows. The air was damp, heavy with mildew and something else, something rotten. Her flashlight beam flickered across an old wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and a foul smell seeped from the crack. Against her better judgment, she pushed it open. The beam of her flashlight revealed an old storage room, the walls lined with shelves stacked with forgotten boxes. In the center of the room, the floorboards had been pulled up, leaving a gaping hole. The scratching noise was louder now, echoing from the darkness below. Claire knelt at the edge of the hole, shining her light down. The beam illuminated dozens of eyes, small, gleaming points of light staring back at her. Rats, hundreds of them, packed together in a writhing, undulating mass. But something was wrong. They weren't running or hiding. They were watching, waiting. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The basement fell deathly silent. Claire's breath caught in her throat as a low, guttural sound rose from the pit. Not from the rats, but from something deeper. The rats began to part, their bodies scuttling aside to reveal a shape emerging from the shadows. It was wrong. A twisted figure, more skeletal than flesh, pulled itself up from the pit, its elongated limbs twitching. Its face was obscured, but she could feel it staring at her, a hollow, hungry presence. The rats clustered around its feet, their eyes never leaving Claire. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating scurrying rats and twisted shadows. Claire ran, the sound of skittering claws echoing behind her. She slammed the basement door shut, locking it and shoving a heavy chair against it. But the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, coming from inside her apartment. That night, the neighbors heard screams, followed by silence. When the landlord opened Claire's apartment the next day, it was empty, except for a small hole in the floor and the faint sound of scratching echoing from below. Months passed after Claire's disappearance. The building sat mostly empty, its hallways filled with a heavy silence. Only a few tenants remained, those who couldn't afford to leave. Among them was Sam, a university student who had moved in after hearing about the discounted rent. He dismissed the stories as urban legends, ghost tales meant to scare off the superstitious. But on his third night, Sam heard the scratching. It began as a faint sound beneath the floorboards in his room, just like the others had described. A rhythmic, insistent noise, like tiny claws tapping from below. He rolled his eyes, pulling his headphones over his ears, drowning it out with music. Yet, the next night, the scratching returned, louder, more persistent. This time, it seemed to move, following him from room to room. At midnight, as he sat at his desk studying, the sound grew violent, like nails raking the wood. Sam's hands trembled. "Rats," he whispered to himself, trying to calm his pounding heart. "Just rats." He knelt beside the floor, pressing his ear to the boards. For a moment there was silence. Then, from directly beneath him, the scratching exploded in a frenzy, so loud it felt like the floor was vibrating. He jumped back, his heart pounding. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at his door. He froze. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. Swallowing his fear, he opened the door. The hallway was empty. As he closed the door, a whisper echoed from the floorboards. "Help us." Sam stumbled backward. It wasn't his imagination. The voice was clear, desperate. He grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to prove to himself that this was just some bizarre trick. Kneeling, he pried up one of the floorboards. The moment it lifted, a wave of putrid air hit him, smelling of decay and something far worse. He shone the flashlight into the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. A narrow tunnel stretched beneath the floor, lined with scratch marks and bones. Small, human-like, but twisted and deformed. Rats scurried through the tunnel, but they weren't running. They were watching. Their eyes glowed in the light, reflecting something intelligent. Sam's flashlight flickered. In the shadows, deeper in the tunnel, he saw movement. Something large and skeletal, its limbs too long, its body emaciated. It crawled on all fours, its hollow eyes fixed on him. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Join us!" The rats swarmed up, pouring from the hole. Sam screamed, dropping the flashlight, stumbling back. He ran for the door, but the rats were faster. They climbed his legs, biting and clawing, dragging him to the floor. As he struggled, the thing in the tunnel rose, pulling itself up through the hole. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human skull, its mouth stretching into an impossible grin. The last thing Sam heard was the deafening sound of scratching, all around him, inside him. Then, silence. Days later, the landlord found Sam's room empty, the floorboards perfectly intact, no sign of any disturbance. The only clue was a faint scratching sound coming from deep beneath the floorboards. The building was demolished soon after, but those who lived nearby swore that on quiet nights, if you stood where it once stood, you could hear it. The scratching, growing louder, more desperate. And if you listened closely enough, you'd hear the whisper, "Join us." Years passed, and the lot where the building once stood became a vacant scar in the middle of the city. The demolition company had left it untouched, avoiding the project after a series of accidents involving workers, broken limbs, sudden illnesses, even a fatal fall. Locals called it cursed ground. Then a developer decided to build a new complex on the site, luxury apartments, sleek and modern. The past was forgotten in favor of profit. Construction crews worked day and night, but whispers spread among the workers. Tools disappeared, shadows moved where they shouldn't, and at night some swore they heard it, scratching beneath the foundations. Rebecca moved into the new complex shortly after it opened. She was drawn by the building's sleek design and surprisingly affordable rent. A fresh start, she told herself, unpacking her boxes. The first few nights were quiet, peaceful even. But on the fifth night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a faint scratching beneath the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She'd heard the stories, laughed them off as superstitions. But now, she stood, pressing her ear to the floor. The sound stopped. Just as she was about to pull away, there was a sudden, violent thud beneath her. She jumped back, her breath catching. The thud came again, followed by the scratching, frantic now, like something was trying to escape. Rebecca tried to convince herself it was just rats. She called maintenance the next day, but the worker found nothing. "No pipes down there," he said, scratching his head. "Solid concrete. Weird, though. Some of the guys complained about the same thing during construction." That night, the scratching grew louder. It didn't stop, didn't move. It was right below her, constant, insistent. She couldn't sleep. At midnight, she heard a whisper, faint but clear. Help us." Her blood ran cold. She grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source. She pried up a corner of the floorboard near the edge of the room, revealing a narrow gap. The air that seeped out was icy and foul, filled with the smell of mildew and rot. She shone her flashlight into the gap. At first, she saw nothing, just darkness. But then, eyes, dozens of them reflecting the light, watching her. The scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, a skeletal hand shot up from the darkness, fingers clawing at the edge of the floor. Rebecca screamed, stumbling back. The hand pulled, and a face emerged, twisted, hollow-eyed, grinning with an impossible mouth. "Hungry," it whispered. The floor beneath her cracked and splintered. She tried to run, but the ground gave way, and she fell into darkness. The next morning, Rebecca's apartment was empty. The floor was perfectly intact, no sign of damage. Maintenance found no trace of her. The building's management covered it up, another sudden move-out, they said. But the tenants knew. They heard the scratching. It grew louder, spreading from apartment to apartment. Some left. Others stayed, hoping it would stop. It never did. And beneath the floorboards, something waited, hungry, watching. The scratching spread, a sinister plague infecting the building, seeping through walls and floors. Some tenants ignored it, convincing themselves it was just old pipes or settling concrete. Others weren't so lucky. They swore they heard whispers in the night, voices calling their names. The building became a hushed place, the once promising luxury apartments now half empty, the remaining residents tense and hollow-eyed. David, a journalist drawn by the stories, moved in to investigate. He'd written about urban legends before, but this felt different. As he settled in, he listened for the scratching, waiting for the moment it would begin. It didn't take long. On his first night, at exactly midnight, it started, a faint, rhythmic noise beneath the floorboards. He pressed his ear to the ground, recording the sound on his phone. But when he played it back, the scratching was gone. In its place was a whisper, faint and distorted. "You can't leave." Chilled, David dug into the building's history. He found the reports about Claire, Sam, Rebecca, disappearances, strange accidents, whispered rumors of curses. His investigation led him to an old man named Harold, a former construction worker who had helped build the new complex. Harold lived in a cramped apartment across town, his hands shaking as he spoke. "We found something when we dug the foundation," he whispered. "An old tunnel. We were told to seal it, but the walls kept scratching like something was alive down there." David pressed for more, but Harold refused to speak further. "They're still down there, and now they're hungry." That night, David heard the scratching again. It was louder, more aggressive, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Get out!" Suddenly, the lights flickered. The air grew cold. The scratching intensified, pounding now, shaking the floor. David grabbed his flashlight, determined to confront whatever lay beneath. He pried up a floorboard, revealing the darkness below. The foul air that seeped out made him gag. He lowered the flashlight into the gap. At first, there was nothing. Then, deep in the shadows, he saw them, eyes, rows of them, staring back. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Join us!" The floor around him began to splinter, cracking open. Skeletal hands reached up, clawing at the edges. David scrambled back, but the floor collapsed beneath him, and he fell into darkness. He landed hard, the flashlight rolling from his grip. The tunnel was cold, damp, lined with scratch marks and bones. The walls seemed to breathe, a low guttural sound vibrating through the earth. He picked up the flashlight, its beam flickering. In the distance, something moved. The figure was tall, twisted, its limbs too long, its face a grotesque mask of bone and stretched skin. It grinned, hollow eyes fixed on him. Rats scurried at its feet, watching, waiting. David ran, the sound of scratching all around him. The tunnel seemed endless, the whispers growing louder, overlapping, until they were a deafening chorus. "You can't leave. Join us. Hungry." Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell again, deeper this time, into a cavern filled with bones, human and rat mingled together. The figure stood above him, its grin widening. David's screams echoed through the tunnel, lost in the scratching. The next day, his apartment was empty. No sign of a struggle, no trace of him. The building was condemned again, but the lot remains untouched. At night, if you pass by, you can still hear it, the scratching beneath the ground, growing louder, spreading. And if you stand there long enough, the whispers will call your name, inviting you into the darkness.